cooking and cooking and cooking and cooking and cooking. Cooking and cooking and cooking and cooking and cooking and cooking and stirring and stirring and stirring and stirring and stirring.
It looks like the cameraman is stirring it.
And stirring, though I'm not. And stirring and stirring and stirring and stirring and stirring and stirring and patting and turning and turning and stirring some more and stirring and stirring and tapping and setting it downing and cooking and cooking and cooking and cooking and cooking and cooking and cooking. Stop. And lifting and putting it back in. And straining 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 and tossing 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 and lifting and pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring and stirring. And buttering and tapping and stirring. And stirring and stirring and stirring. You forgot the cheese. You forgot the milk. And stirring and stirring and stirring and and pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring.
Is it a cup or a fourth of a cup?
It's 1/4 of a cup. And pouring. Pouring a little bit more. And pouring back. And setting down and lifting and setting down and shaking and shaking and flicking some more and flicking and ripping and opening and cheesing and cheesy and cheesing and cheesing and cheesing and stirring 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 and stirring and cheesing and stirring and cheesing and stirring and stirring and stirring and stirring and cheesing and stirring and stirring and stirring and stirring and cheesing and stirring and stirring and cheesing and stirring and stirring and cheesing and stirring and stirring and stirring and cheesing and shaking and stirring and throwing away and stirring and moving and rolling and stirring 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 and and stirring, and stirring, and stirring, and slamming, and slamming again, and opening, and closing, and opening, and grabbing, and almost dropping, and setting down, and opening, and grabbing, and forking, and closing, and setting down, and stirring, and stirring, and stirring, and scraping or something like that. And eating, and smiling, and smiling, and smiling.